Hi, Tracy. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks. How are you, Kay?
Good, thank you. Good to chat with you. I really enjoyed our last chat, and I think we agreed today that we would talk about listening and hearing.
Mm,
Are
that,
they different things?
that's a big subject, isn't it?
It's one that's really on my radar at the moment, probably for my own personal journey, and something I'm really kind of tuning into when I'm listening to other people. How many people really are listening, and what is it that they're hearing? I'm absolutely fascinated by it as a topic at the moment.
So it sounds like you feel there's a difference between listening and hearing.
Yes, and I've reflected a lot on how over the years, I mean, I've taught communication skills for donkey's years in one guise or another, including listening skills, and active listening and the various permutations of listening. But somehow there's something different on my radar at the moment, which is, are we translating the incoming sound waves and hearing our interpretation of what is being said rather than truly listening to what the other person is saying?
Mm.
And so, yes, I do think that there is a difference between listening and hearing.
Mm.
What
So
about you?
I think there's something there about applying our filters. I think, is that what you mean by interpretation? Kind of the world according to us.
Mm,
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, I think I would agree that it's easy to hear something that's either perhaps not intended or hear more than was intended or less than was intended, perhaps depending on how we are at the time of hearing, of
mm.
listening. Yes, it can get confusing, can't it?
Yeah, a metaphor I carry in my mind is that it's kind of a bit like that satir iceberg metaphor, where the output of somebody, their behaviors, their words, their language, their expressions, that's just the tip of the iceberg, and what sits beneath it is a huge big structure that contains all of life experience, sort of hardwired, inherited goals, and learned goals through values and beliefs and so on. And I kind of think about that just beneath the surface, those filters. So our strong beliefs are the primary filters. So somebody says, I don't know, a question like, how many apples do you want me to buy? And the other person answers, why why do you always ask me that question? You always ask me the same question again, and that's just not fair. Why is it you don't trust me? You don't think that I can retain that information? And so they answer a different
Mm,
thing to what has actually been spoken.
mm,
And so that tells me that the incoming words, data, sound waves, has landed on a belief
mm-hmm,
or a mind read, or some such thing.
mm,
And that's where the person, the receiver, answers from. They find the answer from what they're doing inside their mind rather than what's actually being spoken.
mm. And that can be different, not just from day to day, but actually at any time of day, depending on our kind of most recent experience. So,
Mm.
for example, if you've been driving and it's been really busy traffic and you're anxious because you're late for something, and the weather's dreadful, and eventually you get there and somebody asks you a question, you can respond to that very differently to how you would hear the question and respond had the journey been a breeze. because of where you're at the time.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I don't know if you know Joost van der Lee is a Dutch NLP master trainer. He has a really cool model, Neurogram, which is his version of Enneagram. And in it, each of the 9 types has a relaxation position and a stress position. And I often think of that as, because we're talking about state, aren't we? Emotional state, and how that influences how we can process sensory data. But yeah, that there is a big swing between being super cool and relaxed and how you hear the information or listen to the information being spoken and find a response, versus the really stressed state. And so, yeah, I think that's a very interesting perspective. And I know you're trained in Myers-Briggs, for example, MBTI, and I'm wondering, is there something similar in that model?
I was actually just thinking about that as you were speaking there, and Myers-Briggs, kind of in terms of personality typing, it identifies that when somebody is stressed, they can go into what's described as the grip, where they almost become a caricature of themselves. So all the behaviors and aspects of their personality type that are true for them almost become more so. And it's quite interesting that when I talk about that with clients, they recognize that, yes, that was them hearing that information and responding, but it was a caricature of themselves as opposed to their more true selves, when they're actually able to find that balance and respond from a balanced place as opposed to that stressed place. And people find that quite illuminating, I think, not just in MBTI terms, but I think in terms of exploring what's happening in the brain, the neurochemicals, all of that sort of stuff. And it can actually, I have seen clients feel quite relieved that oh, okay, so now I understand why that might be happening. Now what can I do to help to manage change, etc. And that's often quite a relief for people, I think.
Yeah, that kind of makes me think about, again, another model I run in my head, which is of a seesaw, really, 2 ends of a spectrum. And, so if we think in NLP terms, a metaprogram, a simple one would be, towards something or away from something. And they are 2 ends of the same spectrum. It depends where you are at. And if you can bring yourself back to the fulcrum and be balanced, then you have more choice about which way to tip it. I think that kind of takes us off in a different topic about how we filter information. Maybe that's something for a future discussion. It is very interesting. Kind of thinking back to the key point of listening or hearing, or and what is the difference. I still believe it's about where we put our attention. If we default to our default lazy brains, and we certainly do that when we're stressed, then we'll only hear what we need to hear in order to be able to get to the next place, to take another action. Whereas when we bring our awareness into what we are hearing, what we are listening to, and we slow everything down, which of course NLP is great for doing that, then we can perhaps listen with more objectivity, with more accuracy. And I think one of the ways to train that perhaps is one of the very early NLP practitioner skills of listening for the rep systems that people are using, whether they are speaking with strong visual language, auditory language, kinesthetic language, and so on. It trains you to start listening through a different filter to the incoming sound waves.
That's actually really, sorry, I was just going to say that's actually a really good reminder of how powerful that can be, especially in a coaching relationship, but also in how valuable would all of that be in terms of building any relationship and avoiding conflict. You know, how many relationships do we hear about where somebody will say, "You're not listening to me," and actually the other person is listening, but they're applying a whole new, a whole different set of rules, really. And actually something as simple as, noticing what rep systems people are using could actually be quite powerful to help to keep a conversation on track, to kind of keep that rapport, even in conflict, to keep the rapport, to keep the conversation useful, I guess.
Again, it comes back to state for me very strongly, and through Happy Brain, when we look at a stressed brain, whether that's a little bit stressed, super stressed, or even into the full survival mode, that the ability to process language literally kind of drops away, because from our primitive survival response needs, we need to listen to the song. We need to hear the emotion behind the words first. And I certainly recognize that myself. If I'm with in a situation that feels a little bit stressful, I can notice that I've flipped into, I am listening for the sentiment behind the words first, which is my own feedback to, do something about your state in order to bring online the critical thinking that enables you to listen to the language as well. But that sort of, those at least two different parallel inputs of language and the meaning of the language, the content, and then the words and the emotion, the song and the emotion that accompanies. It's very interesting.
I remember years and years and years ago doing some counselling training, and obviously, very much majored on listening skills in the certificate. And that exercise that you do where you have to have your back to somebody and talk to them, and kind of how difficult it is when you haven't got the visuals. And actually, from what I know now, they were probably missing a trick in saying, you might not have the visuals, but what other things can you hear that will actually help and give you a clue anyway? I think incorporating that means that if you haven't got the visual, yes, the visual adds, absolutely, but if you haven't got the visual, that actually there are still lots of clues there to help you along.
I think that's true, and I'm reminded of a great session I had with you in your equine facilitated development, where we had to put a bridle on a horse in a team, but the person doing it could only respond quite literally to the instructions being given, and it makes it very difficult for the speaker as well as the listener, because the speaker has to be so precise and the listener has to kind of actually fill in a few gaps, because if because there was a mismatch, and it's a really good fun activity to remind us of the difficulties of clean, clear verbal communication.
And that is it stripped down to the basics, isn't it? Because you're following instructions as to how to do it, and it's probably harder when you know how to do it, because then you can fill in the gaps.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That is a great exercise.
In Samaritan's training, and when we go out into outreach into schools and colleges, a really simple exercise that illustrates what active listening is you read out some instructions, and the group, the listeners, have a piece of paper and a pen, and they follow the instructions. And they're drawing something, and the instructions are very simple, very clear. But in the first exercise, they're not allowed to ask questions. They just have to listen. And they draw, create, craft an image. In the second round of the same exercise, it's exactly the same. The instructions are exactly the same, but the second time they're allowed to ask questions like, well, that circle, how many centimeters is it? And is it in the top corner or the middle or the bottom? And so introducing questions enables you to get much clearer, better quality information. And again, when you are responding to, you are listening to information as it's coming in, and you are asking questions spontaneously to get the next useful bit of information, that for me indicates good, clear, active listening, and it assists a nice communication. But I think what you and I both see with our client work, and certainly in the corporate world, where some people are so busy holding on to what it is they want to say and what their question bank is, they've rehearsed it and primed it, and it's just sat there, that the spontaneity has gone, and the communication misfires, and so they're only listening for an opportunity to say the next thing they want to say that's of value to them.
I tell you where I see that happening a lot in the corporate, well, not so much in the corporate sector actually, but you know, a lot of my experience has been there at interviews in recruitment, especially competency-based interviews. And this is probably slightly off topic, but it you know, it's such an important part of somebody's life in terms of, you know, applying for and going for a new job. And in the competency-based interviews, you're restricted to asking a set question, no matter kind of what the candidate said previously. So they might already have answered the question, but in a competency-based interview, when it's done not very well, you have to ask the question anyway. And even if the question could have benefited from just having a slight nuance to it, you're not allowed to do that for the sake of fairness. Has been some of my experience. I'm not saying that's the right thing. And the candidate then, well, all you get is a rehearsed robotic answer from the candidate, just like you've asked them a rehearsed robotic question. And if only there was, I understand all the things about making it fair and transparent and all of those sorts of things, but there must be ways of doing all of that, but actually make it of better quality, making the interview and the exchange of better quality in that process.
And that reminds me of some of my frustrations in people, the engineers or architects of those systems not understanding the true purpose of them.
Yes. Hmm. Hmm. Yes. Or yes, being fixed on one intention, and the focus is on the transparency,
Mm.
but in doing that, there's the potential to lose lots and lots of other
Mm.
depth, I suppose. And I wonder, in terms of listening and hearing in our own conversations, whether a similar process sometimes happens in terms of what the intention is. And on both sides, is the intention on a par? Have you got that rapport? Is there something that's mismatched? Does that affect the quality of the conversation as well?
Mm. I think that's really true. I am reminded of a pro forma I send out to clients before I book to see them. And if I'm working with children, I will send out another bit of information for the parents, and in that it says, I'm going to chat to your child, and I'm going to, we're going to talk about seemingly irrelevant things. But it's really important for me to be able to hear how they say things and what they say.
Mm.
So you trust me on that process, because that is kind of linked to what you're saying, which is the opportunity for people to speak authentically from lots of different neural pathways rather than a single focus
Hmm.
gives us a lot more information about the individual, doesn't it?
Mm. Yes, absolutely. And I recall actually a client I saw yesterday, um, where I couldn't quite, I suppose, get that understanding of where she was coming from on things. And so I set off on random conversations about lots of other things that were nothing really to do with what the conversation was about. And it was really surprising how quickly I got lots more clues about how she was processing
Mm.
and what her kind of go-to thought processes were. And that really, really helped in the subsequent conversation about the stuff that she'd actually come with. So just
Mm.
getting that context and that bigger picture, and hearing the patterns and the things she said, and yeah, sort of how she said them and so on, was crucial really
Mm.
in that process. Like you say, trust the process.
Always trust the process.
Yeah.
Just kind of final reflection on hearing and listening. I am often amused at, if working in the corporate world, I'll hear a frustrated manager or senior manager saying, how many times do I have to tell them? How many times?
Mm.
And they're not listening to me. They're just not listening to me.
Mm.
Or he doesn't, or she doesn't.
Mm.
And it's a reminder that listening is a two-way process, because
Mm.
clearly they're not listening to the mismatch of feedback that is available to them. And
Mm.
they're not paying attention to me. They're not listening to me. Okay. Well, we know in NLP, we'll say, okay, so the meaning of the communication is the
Mm.
response you get. But if you're not listening yourself to that response,
Mm.
then where does that information go? It just slides off a cliff and goes to another place.
Mm. And that kind of brings you full circle, doesn't it, in terms of sort of as a coach, but not just as a coach, finding a way of communicating such that it does land in the right place for the receiver, and that can only happen if you've been listening really carefully to hear their sort of substructures in terms of how they do that. Um, isn't life beautiful when you get circles and patterns and things like that?
And my full circle is this is something very current for me. I'm always looking at a different aspect of my own awareness and conscious awareness. And gosh, throughout my career, every time I think I've finally nailed something, I turn a corner and think, oh, do you know what? There's so much more. And I really am on a personal mission to increase my ability to listen with more precision and hear what people are really saying. So we shall revisit this, no doubt.
Ah, really, really interesting conversation, as always.
It's great to chat with you, Tracey, as always, and I look forward to the next time.
Brilliant. Speak to you soon. Take care.
You take care too. Bye bye.
Bye.